For me, like when I write, I basically create characters to the point where they are very real people. And then I drop them into into the plot. I drop them into a scenario. But because they're real people to me, I can watch them and they can basically dictate their actions. So I'm more or less watching a movie playing out in my head, and I'm writing it down as fast as I can. The side effect of that is the words, the book itself is very cinematic. So I think when the folks in Hollywood, when they read it, it feels like a movie. And like if you read a lot of my reviews, you're going to see, a lot of them, people point that out. They're like, this was like watching a movie. That being said, like literally nothing of mine has actually been filmed yet. It's all been optioned over and over and over again, but nothing has made it to the studio. To me, that's a numbers game. I put my head down and I just write the next book.
Welcome to the Heart of Show Business. I am your host, Alexia Melocchi. I believe in great storytelling and that every successful artist has a deep desire to express something from the heart to create a ripple effect in our society. Hello to all my listeners of the Heart of Show Business podcast. I haven't been doing as many episodes as I like to lately, but whenever I have a guest on, it's for a very, very special reason. And when I discovered this incredible, worldwide renowned New York Times bestseller author and some of his books and his trajectory of his career, going from obviously publishing with some of the biggest publishing houses to doing it on his own and pivoting and still succeeding at it. And of course, having some of his books already sold to major studios to be made into features, I told myself, I have to bring this gentleman on. So I have with me here J.D. Barker. He is a New York Times bestselling author. His books have been published worldwide with some of the biggest publishing homes. He was a journalist before. He was writing for a lot of magazines, doing celebrity interviews. And then, he went into the indie publishing world back in 2014. So I think it's way before we all caught up into this. And, his novel, Dracul, was sold, of course, into the studios. He's collaborating with some of the greats like James Patterson. He has another thriller called The Fourth Monkey. He's been with HarperCollins. I mean, you just have to look him up. He is a powerhouse in the thriller, supernatural, horror, I don't even think it's true crime, but crime space. I haven't read all your book. Pardon me, because it would take me 5 months to read them. So pardon me for not being fully up to speed, but you are my kind of author. So welcome to my show, JD.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm gonna have to bring you along everywhere I go, and you can just introduce me at the opening of the room when I walk in. That was perfect.
It's my little Hollywood pizzazz. When you're a producer and you have to pitch something in a room, it's like, okay, can we put the highlight reel and just really use the buzzwords and just get people intrigued, right? So yes, I'm for hire. Just kidding.
It's fun. It's fun hearing it like that because, to me, it went by in a blur, but you basically just summed up the last 30 years of my life.
Exactly. And because I want people to be curious about you. I mean, I find it so boring when people start reading off a thing and they're like, oh, and he did this and he did that. It's like, what's the point? You're going to be on my show. You're going to talk about it, which is so fantastic, So I want to hear a little bit about your origin story because, of course, you started out, writing for magazines and doing interviews. What was a pivotal moment for you where you're like, okay, I'm going to be an author, I'm going to write books? And why did you also choose all this very dark genres? Let's put it this way.
Well, like a lot of the people in your audience, I've been writing pretty much my whole life. It was kind of my go-to, just to keep myself sane. It was, something I just did for fun. And my parents encouraged that portion of it. Writing was a fantastic hobby in their eyes, but they kind of drilled home, writing is great for, fun activity, but you can't make a living at it. So you have to get a real job. So I kind of, that's sort of how I spent the first half of my life. I went to high school, finished that up, went to college, ended up getting a degree in finance, another one in business, another one in IT. I got halfway through a psychology degree. Then I ended up working in the finance industry. And through all of that, I would come home and I would write. And one of my first jobs, I worked for BMG Distribution, which was a division of RCA Records down in Fort Lauderdale and Miami. And I was essentially a glorified babysitter. So they would have a recording artist come into town and I'd have to pick them up at the airport, get them to the radio station for their interview, get them to their concert, get them to their hotel, and then get them back on their airplane when it was time to go. And meanwhile, I was going to college during the daytime, which is expensive. So I quickly realized I've got some very famous people in the car with me. They're a captive audience, sometimes for 4 or 5 days at a time. So I started to interview them, and then I would take those interviews and sell them to magazines like 17 and Teen People and Teen Beat and all these other magazines that were huge back in the 90s that are probably gone now. But when you work in that world, when you work for newspapers and magazines, you quickly realize everybody you're working with has a novel at some stage of development. It's in a desk drawer somewhere. They've been working on it for the last 10 years. It's almost done. It's 400,000 words. They're kind of lost. But I was very good with grammar and punctuation. So initially, people would just hand me those books and ask me to just kind of go through it and clean it up for them, which I love doing. It was fun, and that turned into providing developmental advice, and ultimately it turned into a side hustle as a career as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So I was working in finance. After I got out of college, ultimately I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds, but it's one of those jobs that pays really good. So I was kind of stuck. And then I would come home and I would work on these other projects at night. And over 20 some years, I ended up with 6 different books that hit the New York Times list that all had other people's names on the cover that I had essentially written, which gets really old after a while. So when that 6th one hit up, my wife pulled me aside and she said, listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's figure out a way to make this happen. But we were kind of trapped, because I had the big salary, we had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat, our monthly expenses were, somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000. So we couldn't just walk away from all that. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side and lived in the other. And she sat me down at the kitchen table one day and showed me the bank statement and said, okay, this is our savings. It looks like you have about 18 months to make it as a writer. Go. And I know that's a lot of stuff, but that's essentially where I kicked off my career as a full-time author. It's 20 some years in the making and overnight success.
Wow, that is so inspiring. I mean, just that alone, we hit a home run on this one. I mean, first of all, there's one thing that I've seen as a little bit of a common thread for a lot of people who have been successful in their creative endeavors is that they do have a little bit of a business experience. And I am sure that having worked in the financial and business world also helped you think, okay, I wrote this book. Now, how do I sell it? How do I pitch it to, obviously at the beginning, to a publishing home? Or how do I build a brand so that I can get readers, so that I can demonstrate to people that my books are good? Because, we all know back in the day, we did not have algorithms. We did not have, social media as much as we do today. So how did you, once you started getting your first publishing deals, which I'm sure you made it before the deadline, I would think, hopefully. And how did you build the audience? Because your publishing house can only do so much, right? So how did you go about it? Because I know you spoke about personal branding in your talking points, and I'd love to know a little bit how you incorporated your business structure into your creative path.
Well, working in the music business, it's a very similar model to books. And I saw a lot of people come and go. I saw a lot of the mistakes that they made, and I saw what worked and what didn't work. One of the things that has stuck with me my entire life, one of the people that I interviewed was Madonna back in the day when she was touring for Vogue. And we talked about her album promotion. And she said that whenever she had a new album coming out, she would make a list of what she saw everybody else doing at the time. And then when she finished that list, she would make another list of things nobody was doing. And that's essentially essentially what she did to promote her book. I've always thought of it as zigging instead of zagging. So, everybody else is zigging, so you want to zag. You want to do something that's going to make you stand out. So that's always been a benchmark in everything I do from a marketing standpoint. But essentially, I mean, I started in the same place that everybody else did. I had 0 people on my mailing list. I had 0 followers on the social media platforms. You start off with 1, 2, 10, 20, 100, 1,000, and it just kind of grows over time. Each book that I put out is a conscious decision on my part to kind of expand my audience. I tend to bounce around in genres. If you read my Wikipedia page, I think it sums me up the best. And it was crafted with particular language in mind. It says I'm a suspense author who may also include elements of horror, of sci-fi, of this and of that. And we did that on purpose because a lot of times when I do an interview, even like this one, the first place the reporter goes to is that Wikipedia page. So it basically defines who I am as an author. It gives them talking points. From an author's standpoint, by bouncing around in genres, I'm almost like a literary Pied Piper. My first couple of books, I was told by my publishers, my audience was women 45 and over. And I said, that's great. Now, how do I get a different audience? Not that I don't want to replace them. I want to add to it. So I wrote a book that was very heavily young adult. To grab that younger crew. I wrote a prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family to rope in the horror authors or the horror readers. So I'm always looking at each project, how is this going to expand my audience and bring them back into the fold? And as a writer, as long as you have a common thread, like in my case, it's suspense, all of my books kind of have that same look and feel to them, the same kind of pacing. I can branch off a little bit and people will follow along. And it's not a formula that I invented. I studied the big name authors very closely. I studied Stephen King. I studied James Patterson, Dean Koontz, like all these, Nora Roberts, all these people that were selling a ridiculous amount of books to figure out, what they were doing and how. These are the names where you walk into a bookstore, you see their title on the cover, and you don't really care what the book is about. You just buy it because it's them. That's where I wanted to see my career go. So literally everything I've done has been towards that as the end goal.
Wow. And you did make it within the deadline, right? That your wife gave you. Did you make it?
I did. Yeah. I don't think I've ever missed a deadline. I'm autistic, which is something we can talk about if you want to, but that's always kind of been there. If you put a problem in front of an autistic person, we can't do anything else until we get that done. So a book deadline has never been a problem for me.
That is so, and this is absolutely, I mean, that is definitely something to talk about. I did have a guest before. His name is Matthew Kanslow, who is autistic, and he put himself through school, and it took him, years to go over and over again. But he was like, I am going to be a scientist. I'm going to teach. I'm going to go and inspire kids. And I mean, the most amazing challenges, it was never say die. And he approached everything a little bit like you're talking about. It was in a very analytical way. It's like seeing it on a chart, like how in Minority Report, you see the people that are like looking at things and moving them around. That's exactly how he planned his life and he planned his career, and everything he wanted to do, the sciences, the teaching, the degrees and everything. And I would think, when people say autism is not a handicap. Autism is a special ability. I always say that as far as when I'm interpreting it as. So tell me a little bit about that. I mean, was there anybody who turned you down because of it or no?
No, I mean, it essentially, like my social skills have always been terrible. I wasn't diagnosed with autism until I was 22, so I didn't know what was going on. I just knew I had a trouble, being around other people and socializing. But once I got that diagnosis, again, it was a problem that somebody could put in front of me that could be solved. So I started to research autism. I was diagnosed with something called Asperger's, so I researched that in particular. And once I was able to do that, I could I very similar to what I do with books. I made a pro and cons list. These are the negatives that this creates for me. Here are the positives it creates for me. And I worked at, knocking out each of those negatives as best I could. And I doubled down on the positives. One of the things that I learned later, as an autistic person, we tend to mimic our other people in certain situations. It's kind of how we get through life. To give you an example, if I'm standing at a party with 4 or 5 friends and somebody cracks a joke, I may not find it funny, but I'm going to laugh, a millisecond later because everybody else is laughing. I basically copy what I see happening around me to try and appear as normal as possible, which is a silly thing to have to say out loud, but that's essentially what's going on, in an autistic person's head. So mimicking is something I've been doing my entire life. And what I didn't realize is, when I was working as a ghostwriter, I was actually mimicking other authors. And one of the skills that it gives me is I can read, like a couple paragraphs, a couple chapters written by somebody else. I can pick up on their writing style and their cadence and their vocabulary, and I can mimic that writing style. Which, at the time I was in high demand as a ghostwriter because I could write a memoir for somebody else, but in their voice. So that's a skill I've kind of carried over now that I'm writing fiction. It just adds a little bit more authenticity, I think, to my characters because each voice is very different. They're very real people to me when I put them down on paper. So, just like anything else, I just kind of looked at what's working, what's not, and then tried to focus on the good stuff.
Well, you're doing fantastic here to begin with, and you already picked up like the style of my own podcast. And one of the mantras of my own podcast is talent takes you places, mindset takes you everywhere, which I do believe that. And you literally embody that. And I am now I'm gonna have to pick up all your books as if I don't have enough time, but I'm gonna have to read them because I'm totally intrigued. And bringing it back to the books. When you write, is there a thought in the back of your head, I want to see this into a movie or a series, or do you just write the book for the pure pleasure of writing it? And then if it gets sold, like quite a few have of yours, great. If it doesn't, it's not a deal breaker. Like, do you think about seeing the visuals of your stories when you
I've been trying to figure out Hollywood from the beginning, and like the more I look at it, the more confusing it actually gets. Every one of my books have been optioned, with the exception of my very first one. It's got to tie into Stephen King, and because of the legalities of all that, the lawyers tend to tell the studios just to take a step back. It's just not worth the trouble. But every other one that I've written has gotten optioned, and it's funny because I wrote a book called A Caller's Game, and at that point, I think I had 5 options that were already in play. And when I wrote that book, like I consciously tried to write a book that couldn't be filmed. I'm like, I'm going to make something that they can't even, just to see what happens. And then the book came out and Ridley Scott's company picked it up right away. We had talent tied to it right away. And I blow up like half of New York in this book, and I figured that it's just not going to happen. But it just literally just comes down to a budgeting thing. It's like, yes, we can film it. It's going to be a $200 million project, but it can be done. So even that one's moving forward. I think what happens is, for me, like when I write, I basically create characters to the point where they are very real people. And I take them and I drop them into into the plot. I drop them into a scenario. But because they're real people to me, I can watch them and they can basically dictate their actions. So I'm more or less watching a movie playing out in my head, and I'm writing it down as fast as I can. When it's working, that's essentially what it's like. The side effect of that is the words, the book itself is very cinematic. So I think when the folks in Hollywood, when they read it, it feels like a movie. And like if you read a lot of my reviews, you're going to see, a lot of them, people point that out. They're like, this was like watching a movie. This was like watching a movie. So I guess that's the outcome of it. And the bonus is that the folks in Hollywood tend to grab those. That being said, like literally nothing of mine has actually been filmed yet. It's all been optioned over and over and over again, but nothing has made it to the studio. But I'm sure, to me, that's a numbers game. I put my head down and I just write the next book. Sooner or later, I think something's going to get done.
Yeah. And I think it's also because you're getting sold to the powerful guys, and nothing against them, because of course, when you're dealing with companies like Ridley Scott or Paramount or whatever, it's definitely an asset to your own personal brand. But they have so much going on sometimes, and they can only get green light so many projects at any given time, especially when they're expensive. When you're dealing with the indie producers who unfortunately may not have enough cash to pay for those book purchases or productions because they have to basically go out and hassle. Sometimes some of those films get made a little quicker. I mean, I've seen that happen even with The Last Legion of Valerio Manfredi. I mean, obviously it was the Weinsteins, but Alexander the Great was optioned it was first optioned by Ridley Scott's company, then went into Baz Luhrmann's company, then went from Universal to Fox, and they hired a writer, then they didn't like the writer. So it's still sitting there after almost 20 years. And then, Oliver Stone got to do his version of Alexander the Great. But that's something that I've seen. We have one of our own films from one of our authors, that Camelot's cousin, the spy who betrayed Kennedy, David is a historian, so he loves to do history thrillers and things that have to do with politics, because he was also a pastor for, some of the detail of George Bush, bodyguards and Homeland Security. So he loves those stories. We had a well-known actor, Blair Underwood, who partnered up with us, and we announced it in the trades. And 5 years later, nothing has happened, because then, of course, we have the war with Russia, and now it's dealing with Russia, and we can't do anything. So you're right; it is very confusing, because there is a lot of moving parts. The streaming wars. The Hollywood strikes, the pandemics, the shutdown. But I'm sure your stuff will see itself on the screen, because one of the great things, and I don't know if you read it in the news, now everything is about books. So even in Hollywood, you're having Tubi, who's a major platform from YouTube that is a streamer and financier. They're starting their own book division so that they can develop book to make into features. So I find that fascinating, because you're almost like a pioneer, into what you started to do, because now everybody wants books. Like, no kidding.
Well, it's funny because you can actually revive content. So there's a movie from the 90s called Flatliners, which has always been one of my all-time favorites. It's got Kiefer Sutherland in it, Julia Roberts, Kevin Bacon, Billy Baldwin, Oliver Platt, all these people basically at the start of their career, so they were unknown at the time, but then they went on to do these crazy, amazing things. I have loved that movie my entire life. And the guy who wrote it, his name is Peter Filardi. He's actually on the Dracul project, working on that. And I started bugging him years ago. I was like, hey, if you ever get the rights back to this, I've got an idea. And the studio had the rights. They weren't going to release it. So I just kind of figured that was never going to happen. And then in January, he gave me a call and he's like, hey, Columbia gave me my rights back. Do you still want to do something? So we basically came up with an idea, a fresh take on the Flatliners, a storyline. So basically a way to reboot the franchise. But we're doing this completely backwards. So rather than the movie coming out, I'm writing a book based on the original screenplay that he wrote, but with a completely new storyline, new twist to it, to take it into the 21st century. So we announced that when we first signed the contract. All the studios jumped all over it. We've got a crazy list of studios that want it at this point. We haven't even finished writing the book yet. But so we're basically rebooting what was originally a movie, was never a book, is now coming back as a book first that will become a movie. I'm not actually the first person to do this. Meg Garner did it with Heat 2. She wrote the sequel to that movie Heat, which was another fantastic movie. And nobody expected anything like that. It started off as a movie. They wrote a book, based on, to follow that storyline and take it into a new direction. And now that's in development as another feature film. So I'm constantly encouraging authors, get out there, take a look at IP, that still stands, that works well today. You never know, if what you can reboot, and if you don't ask the question, if you don't give it a try, it's never going to happen. So you gotta, if you find one, light up somebody's email box, see what happens. Worst case, somebody will say no, but at least you got an answer.
You're absolutely right about this. In fact, we are, I published my own book, but mine is all about mindset and, how to navigate Hollywood. And I self-published it. And it was really done because of all the courses that I've done on pitching and all of that. I just wanted to offer my Cliff Notes version of how to succeed in Hollywood and beyond. And then we started developing, true story, set in Hollywood New York of the 1920s, sort of like the woman that went against Lucky Luciano and Al Capone, a true story, true biopic. And we wrote the feature scripts. We commissioned both the script of her and her son, because he became a spy, and all incredible story. But guess what? We just turned those two scripts into a novel, and the novel is coming out January 15th, and because we said, what? Let's build the audience. It's a very expensive, movie to make, or actually two movies. Let's get those two movies and condense them and turn them into a novel. So I think a lot of people are doing that as well. They're turning existing movie scripts and going, what? I don't think I have enough traction on that as much as I want to, because they're expensive. Let me build the audience. I think also the writer from, I think it's the writer from Twilight. She was self-published as well, if I'm not mistaken. There's quite a few people. 50 Shades of Grey. I think that was pretty much hybrid publishing, self-publishing. Was there a moment, was your decision to go from traditional publishing to your indie publishing financially driven, or was it more about having control about the trajectory of your book and or your books in plural?
It was a mix of everything. So I indie published the first title. So I kind of got a taste of that world and ended up selling a lot of copies. We sold about 250,000 copies of it, which was enough to put me on the radar of the traditional guys. If you sell a lot of books as an indie, they watch those lists very closely. So when I went to sell my next book, I ended up getting a 7-figure deal with a movie and TV show attached to it for the Fourth Monkey series on the traditional side. It was initially with HMH, which is now part of HarperCollins. But my next several books we published on the traditional model. And there were a couple things that I got that taste of being indie. And I think that's what really, sparked a lot of my decisions, because you've got 100% control over everything from your cover to your formatting. I hired professionals across the board. So even though I indie published, I still had copy editors. I still, hired the best formatters out there. I wanted to make sure that an indie published title, if it came out, it was still on par with something coming out of Random House, because in my eyes, that's my real competition. So it had to look like something, coming out of the big houses. But so I basically got a taste of all that. The economics were a big part of it, because as an indie author, you get roughly 70 cents on the dollar, which is fantastic. And on the traditional side, you're lucky if you get 15 to 20 cents on the dollar. So they hand you a nice big check at the get-go, which is great. But you have to pay that money back, and you have to pay it back in these small little increments. So I did a couple of books on the traditional side, and then I really started questioning all of this. And then I went to my agent and I said, listen, on this next one, which was a caller's game, I'm going to retain English rights for myself. I'm going to put them out through my own press. You're welcome to sell all the foreign territories like you normally do. And I'm in about 150 different countries, 20 to 30 different languages or so. So there was still a big market for that. But that was basically my first step as a hybrid author. We traditionally published the book in some places. I indie published it in others. A year after the book came out, I looked at the list of, countries where it was published. And, if it was in a language or not in a language where I wanted it to be, I hired my own translators and put it out there. So I did that for a couple of books. Then about a year ago, I had finished up a book called Behind a Closed Door, which started gaining a lot of interest from the Hollywood side straight off the bat. And they dubbed it 50 Shades meets David Fincher's The Game. So my agent wanted to take it out. He was like, let's just shop it and see what happens. So he shopped it to all the big publishing houses. We had a number of them that wanted it. It was going to go to auction. We ended up signing a film deal before we signed anything on the publishing side. And then I got a phone call from a friend of mine who works at Random House. And she said, listen, we're about to offer on your book in the auction, but you need to turn it down. And I asked her why, and she said, well, we're about to lay off a bunch of people, including the editor who wants your book. I got a similar phone call from somebody at HarperCollins about a week later, and then all these layoffs happened across the board. And if you've ever known an author who has a book that's at a publishing house and you lose your editor, like that book can end up in limbo for a very long time. A lot of it depends on your contract. You may get your rights back, you may not, depending on the language in that contract. But that all scared me because I didn't want this book to have that kind of fate. So I kind of reached back to my friends in finance that I had worked with years ago. Simon & Schuster had just recently been bought by a private equity firm. So I reached out to Simon & Schuster, and ultimately I struck a deal where they let me create my own imprint with Simon & Schuster handling my print sales and distribution, which is what I'm doing now. So I basically have the best of both worlds. I get to act as an indie author. I can put out whatever books I want, whenever I want. But I have Simon & Schuster as the backbone. So they're getting those books into all the places that I couldn't get to as an indie author. So you'll find them in Costco, in the grocery store, at the airport, all those places indie authors are, at this moment, can't get into. I'm able to get my titles there. So that's what I'm doing now. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense because from a financial standpoint, I'm collecting revenue as an author, as the publisher, and from Simon & Schuster's standpoint, it makes sense too, because, I'm the publisher, I'm taking on the financial burden of the cost of a print run, let's say. But if the book does well, they profit too. So it made sense for them to partner with me. And I think you're going to see other authors, other publishers do similar deals to this in the next couple of years, because to me, it's the next logical step of this. Because if you take a big indie author who's selling a ridiculous amount of books, a traditional publisher will wave $1 million check in front of them. that author is going to say no because they know the economic side of it. They know that they don't need that money up front. They'll make it back on the other side. But if you change it a little bit, you offer a deal similar to the one that I signed, all of a sudden that indie author can get their title into a lot of different places, and still collect the same revenue that they were getting before as an indie. That's a no-brainer, I think, from all sides. So I think that's where you're going to see this entire industry go.
I think it's happening globally, and you hit the spot on that one. I think it's happening also in the film distribution arena. I mean, you've seen how many movies you're seeing now ending up on Netflix have already been seen on HBO. They've been HBO productions or Amazon, but then they end up in Netflix. And with a lot of indie filmmakers too, when they're making the smaller movies, I always say to them, don't get the big sale with Apple or Amazon or whatever, because once you're tied into that, that's it. You have no other ways to exploit your film. But if you start with a niche, for example, if you're having, say, a sports movie, go to all like the platforms that are putting out sports films, so that you're going to have your audience right there. Play that out, play the different niches and whatever the themes are of your movie. And then you can still end up with the big boys or girls or publishers. So I think it's happening on a global scale. It's happening in the music business. It's happening in the streaming and in the distribution model, in the production model. It's happening in the author model. Now, I'd like to address the elephant in the room, because obviously there's all this talk about AI and ChatGPT and all of that. Are you finding this tool helpful to you as an author, or is that kind of ticking you off because you're seeing everyone and their mother thinking, I'm going to be an author and I'm just going to put an idea into ChatGPT, it would write me a book and I'll publish it and it will do just as well as your book? What do you think?
We are years away from that actually happening. At least that's what I tell myself when I get up in the morning. So I use all the different tools, the AI tools, more because I really want to understand where they're at from a developmental standpoint. My personal favorite is one called Claude, which isn't available worldwide. There's only a handful of places where you can get it, but it just seems to write very well certain things. So I can feed a book into it. I can tell it, give me the text for the back of the book, those 200 words, the back of book blurb. It can do a fantastic job at that. And if you don't like what it gives you, you just give me something else. You just type that in. 10 seconds later, it gives you something else. So you can tweak that. You can get a tagline for your book. It's fantastic at creating ad copy. But can it write a book? No. Because essentially what ends up happening, and if you think about the tech itself, you're talking to an encyclopedia. All it can do is regurgitate what it's already been told, which means that it can't have an original thought. It can communicate things that have already been done. But in my world, that just doesn't work. So like for an AI, 1 + 1 always equals 2. But when you write a thriller, 1 + 1 really needs to equal 3. You need to surprise people. I write books with James Patterson. If Jim and I get on the phone and we brainstorm an idea, he will come up with some crazy things out of left field that I would have never thought of, that an AI could never possibly come up with. So that's our edge as humans. Our voice, our writer voice, is our other edge. I don't think an AI is ever going to be able to duplicate my writer voice. And I've been told, people have said, if you want to duplicate Stephen King, all you got to do is feed all of his books into an AI, and it's going to learn how to write like Stephen King. If you think about it, that's actually not the case. You would have to upload every experience that Stephen King, the person, has ever had, every interaction he's ever had. All of that would have to go in there, and then maybe it might be able to duplicate that. So that's never going to happen. And if it does, I think it's probably years away. I mean, AI has to have an original thought before it even becomes competition at this point.
Yeah, and I think right now, as you said, it's useful to cut the hours of the more tedious things, like writing the back of a book cover, or maybe doing, a little quick synopsis so you can put it into your book presentation and then you can edit it yourself. It can give you that, but I don't think it was like they were talking about this at the Producers Guild of America Awards, and they said, producers, your job is safe with AI, because ultimately when you have to go in the room, and same thing like you're talking with authors, and you have to pitch an idea and you have to say, there is a shark that speaks. AI wouldn't be able to come up with a story that, because they're going to say, wait, sharks don't speak. It's going to go into that. But you as a storyteller, as a champion of storytellers, you can invent the craziest things in the room and you can pitch them. You can't pitch them as a machine. And I think that goes, like you said, somebody would have to get into your mind and to your thought of saying, oh, what is Jay thinking about all day long? What does he want to do next? How does he act in this situation? And I think that's something that is probably, hopefully, 100 years away. Before we even close it to my famous question that I asked you before, because this has been such an inspiring conversation. Obviously, you had this challenging moment at the beginning of your career, which was you gave yourself a deadline with your wife, you sold everything, and you just, I got to do this, or forget about it. Were there other moments once you peaked in your career, although there's never really a peaking, were there other moments where you've encountered a major stumbling block, which you had to get yourself out of it? And what type of mindset did you use, or what type of logic did you use to get yourself out of it? I know it's a very complicated, long-winded question.
I mean, I tend to, I mean, there's always another brass ring, like there's always something more that you want to obtain, like I won an award, so now I'm an award winning author. I can put that on the cover. I hit a bestseller list. Now I can put that on there. I'm a New York Times bestseller. I can put that on there. But in my mind, like in reality, my highest place on the New York Times list was #2. I've never actually hit #1, which means, you can't put #2 New York Times bestseller on the list. So I'm still striving to get that #1. There's always something bigger. But I tend to look at what's working and what's not. Everything in my life tends to come down to that. I make a lot of lists of what's working and what's not. Very early on, I looked at branding. If you walk into a bookstore, particularly if you're on the traditional side, they're going to make the title of your book huge, and the author name is this tiny little scribble, at the top or the bottom that you can't see unless you get right up on it. But if you look at the big name authors, the ones that are selling well, the Stephen Kings of the world, their name is huge on the cover, and the title is this tiny little scribble. So that is the ultimate goal from my standpoint. So I started watching my book covers that were coming out of the traditional market and pushing for that. Ultimately, I created a trademark version of my name, which I now license back. So if one of the traditional publishers wants to put my name on the cover of the book, which they have to do if I write it, they have to actually pay me a license fee in order to put my name on the cover. I developed my own covers, the images, and I license those back. So rather than having a publishing house create the book cover for me, I do it and I give them the option to license that cover. And I do that on a worldwide basis. And it may seem silly, but like the cost of creating the cover is maybe $1,000 to $2,000 to get a really good one. I license each of them for anywhere from $500 to a couple $1,000 per country. The same image over and over again. So like I look at every aspect of my business and figure out what's working and what's not, how to capitalize it, how to monetize it, how to improve it. Recently, I just created a new line of co-authored titles, because as an individual, I can put out 2 to 3 books a year at my writing pace. But to me, that's not enough. Working with James Patterson, I think has fed that a little bit. I've studied his business model very closely. So now I'm working with co-authors. The book behind me, We Don't Talk About Emma. I wrote it with a guy who lived in New Orleans for a number of years. Like he knows the city inside and out. He knows the people, he knows the places, he knows the smell of the city. Like New Orleans is a character by itself. And like I could write a book about New Orleans and I could probably Google enough to be able to fake my way through what I needed to. But having somebody who really knows that city inside and out, it adds an authenticity to the story that I couldn't create on my own. So I seek out co-authors that can bring in an expertise from left field to add a dynamic to the book. So I am always looking at ways to expand my craft and my business model and take everything to the next level.
Wow, I absolutely love that. And again, I always say art is a collaborative, effort, whether it's writing a book or making movies. And it always ticks me off sometimes when there is either a filmmaker or, filmmakers have to do their own directing, although sometimes it can be too, but, writers or authors, you have to be open. I mean, look at you, you're collaborated with James Patterson. So I love that you are open to bringing in other authors who can give something maybe different inside your books. How do you do those partnerships though? I mean, are you the lead author and then you just find somebody, or can somebody come to you and say, JD, listen, I have an idea. I've been writing this book. I love to partner up with you because I love your brand, of course, and I love your name and I love your expertise. Can we do something together? Are you open to this type of collaborations?
Yeah, I mean, they all come to. It's like the Hollywood stuff. Like no two books have come together the same way. I spend a lot of time mentoring other authors. It's something I really enjoy. Taking somebody like if they've got that writer gene, like I can tell. Like it just jumps out. This person can write, but they may not understand the business. They may not understand pacing. They may not understand this or that. I've been there, done that, so I can teach them. All those different things. So when I bring in somebody to co-author a book, it's a give take on both sides. I'm getting a book out of it in the end, but they're getting a major education in how to write a thriller. And then on the flip side, that book is going to come out through Simon and Schuster, which is something that would be difficult for many authors to obtain. It's going to be in virtually every bookstore. It's going to be anywhere where you find books. It's going to come out in a lot of countries. That gives them a big leg up. So when they write their next book on their own, they basically walk into that project with this education behind them. So they're writing a much tighter book than they would have before. And they've got an established track record on a worldwide basis. So when they walk into an agent or a publisher, they can say, hey, here, this is my last book. Here's how it's done. And that agent can use that same knowledge. They pitch that book in Spanish. They can talk to a Spanish publisher, and that Spanish publisher is going to be able to see that person's name as already sold books in their country. So it just gives them a huge leg up.
Oh my goodness, I love that. I'm already thinking about so many people who could use, who could use working with you on that. And I know there's only so many hours in the day, but I love that you're giving back this way. How does your wife feel about like you being such a multitasker and being so busy? Do you even have any time for your personal life? And I know you live, outside of the city, I think right now. And so you're having a little bit more of a quieter life, correct?
Yeah, when we were in Pittsburgh and the book started hitting, we realized we're living in Pittsburgh and we don't have to. So we started looking all over the country. We bought a house on an island right off the coast of Portsmouth in New Hampshire, which we love. I can look out my office window and I can see the water. The elementary school that my daughter goes to is right across the street, so she can walk to school. It's very picturesque. So we've got a fantastic life. One of the things that honestly started happening when the book started to take off, they start coming out in different countries, and I would get interview requests from these different places, and they would come in at like crazy hours. Like, we need you at 11 o'clock at night. We need you at 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. And initially I took all of them because, that's what I was told to do. But you can't sustain a career, I think, doing that. So in today's world, I have a quitting bell that runs at 3 o'clock every day. Like, that's when my business day ends, no matter what. So any kind of interview, any business activity, everything's got to be done before 3 p.m. 3 o'clock, I go for a run around the island to kind of clear my head, and then I come home and I spend the rest of the night with my daughter and my wife, and we have family time. So, I just try to enjoy all of it.
There's always a need for discipline in life, and you know what? Thank God for Zoom, right? And thank God for all the positive aspects of this pandemics and lockdown is that now you probably don't have to go on so many book tours. You can do your own book tour over Zoom and talk to everybody. You don't have to get on the plane and travel the world. You can do this like this, which I'm sure makes it easy and makes the family happier and everything. This has been such a great conversation, JD. I'm so happy that we connected and you gave so much information and so much wisdom and so much inspiration already to me personally, and respect obviously for the craft. We're getting to the famous life quote, life mantra that your go-to. Have you thought of one since you and I started and pushed the record button?
Yeah. So early on working with James Patterson, one of the things that he told me is at the top of he writes everything by hand. He does it on a notebook. And at the top of every page, he writes the words, "Be there." And it sums up a lot of different things, and we really drove that home when we were writing the first book together. Be there in the scene with the characters, right there down on the ground. Like, be in that scene, be in that moment. But it's taken on another meaning to me because as an autistic person, I tend to focus very heavily on either where I've been or where I'm going. I don't necessarily spend a whole lot of time in the actual moment. So, for me, be there also means, be there in the present, enjoy the whatever's happening around you right now. don't dwell on the past, don't spend time thinking about the future, but be there in the current moment. So I try to do that too. So be there, I think, is probably my go-to phrase right now.
I love it. And you certainly are applying that just by your own life rule that you stop working after 3 p.m. and you're taking your time to be with the family. And thank God, like I said, you're busy, but at least you're physically there. That's, I think, the joy of being an artist, a writer, a producer, whatever. We don't have to be out clocking in and clocking out. Like you said, we can still be there for the people that we care about the most. So it's the one that we just mentioned and I see on the wall. Is that the next book that is out right now that we need to plug in and promote? When is the drop? Has it already dropped?
I have so many books coming out. So my last one, depending on when this airs, so my last one was called Heavier the Stones. It released in November. We Don't Talk About Emma, which is the one that's behind me. That one comes out in February. In March, I have a book coming out with James Patterson called The Writer, which is one of the funnest books I think I've ever worked on. Definitely my favorite of the ones I've worked with Jim. And then in May, I've got a crazy one about a haunted house on an island. And it's based on a real house that I see every day when I go on my run around the island. And the tagline for the book is, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So you basically know where the story is going. And it's one of those books. It was the scariest book I think I've ever written. I worked on it for a number of years. I had to keep putting it aside, but eventually I got it done. And it's a frightening tale.
Wow. Well, this interview is going to become coming out early in 2025, definitely in January. So yeah, so we'll definitely be able to mention some of those books and even the ones that are coming out whenever, you have specific drop dates. I mean, do let us know. We'll continue to plug the episode. It has been such a true joy and pleasure to have you on my show, JD. I cherish the conversation. And for any of you who have questions about JD and you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, rate, review. As you all know, I don't have to repeat myself. I don't have sponsors. I'm doing it out of the love for the craft. So please do support me, but also support my guests by clicking on their website, clicking on their Amazon author pages, buying their books, because, we want to keep them turning out great storytelling. Thank you for being on my show, JD.
Oh, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
It's been great. It's been great, everybody. The Heart of Show Business, over and out. Ciao.